Hi, I'm Brian Worley from p4pictures.com. This is a talk through of my presentation for Canon UK at the photography show in Birmingham, March 2017. This presentation is about customising your EOS, and the idea is to teach you a few things that your EOS has in terms of settings that help you to operate it quicker and use it more effectively. So the topics I'm going to cover in the presentation, there's just a few short ones. It's about changing your focus points a bit quicker. I'm also going to talk about back button focusing. So this is a technique used by sports and wildlife photographers in the main, about where you can stop the camera focusing using the shutter button, but focus using a button on the back. We'll explain some more coming up. I'm also going to talk about custom shooting modes. That's that C1, C2 or C3 positions on the mode dial that you've seen on your cameras, and it gives you some examples of how you might use them and how you set them up. And lastly, I'm going to give you a quick look at the My menu, which is the green zone on many of the cameras, where you can join several functions together and provide real quick, easy access to the stuff that you use day in, day out when you're working and using your camera. So normally, when you change focus points, you've got to press the AF selection button, which is the one on the top right corner of the back of the camera, and then you either move the joystick, you press the multifunction buttons. In the case of a 5D3 or 4 or 7D2, you can use the AF selection levers, but ultimately you've got to do quite a few things before you can move the focus point. What I've always found is that it's much faster and easier, and you'll use more of the focus points if you can actually just change the position of the focus point with the camera up at your eye. So you're looking through the viewfinder and you move your thumb and the AF points move. So this is a section we're going to show you how to make that possible for a good number of cameras. For 5D Mark IV and 7D Mark II customers, you'll see how it's even possible to change the arrangement of the focus point, whether you want to go from a single point to multiple points really quickly, also with the camera still held at your eye. Direct selection of AF points is done through the custom controls in your cameras. Here we've got some pictures showing the 80D and the 5D Mark IV at the info screen, so you can just press info on the back of your cameras until the screen's displayed, and then you press the Q button or tap on the Q on the screen if it's a 5D4, and you're looking for that icon which looks like a camera with 3 lines coming out the side. That's the custom controls icon. You'll also find custom controls in the custom functions within the menus of your cameras. So that's the orange zone typically, where you'll find the custom functions. Actual fact, if you use the custom functions, they stay on screen a little bit longer than it does when you go through the quick controls. Now, all of the above cameras, so that's the 1DX Mark II, 1DX, 5DS, DSR, 5D4, 5D3, 6D, 7D2, 7D, 80D, 70D, all have this ability to speed up selection of AF points. So directly selecting your AF points is not enabled by default. So what we need to do is to go into that custom controls, press the set button to get there, and you get presented a display something like this, which shows the buttons that are customizable for your camera. And what I'm doing is I'm going to navigate down to the multi-controller. So the multi-controller takes a variety of different forms. On some of the cameras it looks like a mini joystick that you can nudge up and down, left, right. And in other cameras it's the panel that's inside the quick control dial on the back of the camera. So that's things like the 80D and the 70D have that kind of layout. But ultimately that's where we're going to change the function. So it's by default it's actually turned off to do nothing, and what we need to do is to make it direct selection. And in this slide you can see that when you press set, having moved to that function, you've now got the option to do direct AF point selection. So it doesn't matter whether it's an 80D or in this case 5D Mark IV, the process, it all looks pretty much the same. The only difference is that with a 5D Mark IV, 5D3, 5DSs, 7D, 7D2s, you have an extra bit where it says info for the detail settings. And we'll come to that in a minute, but the key thing you have to do is set it to direct AF point selection. And if you have pressed that info button, you'll then see that you can choose what happens when you push the joystick straight into the back of the camera body. Normally you just nudge it left, right, up and down, but actual fact, by pushing it into the body, it would cause the AF to jump to the center focus point. So that's a quick way to get back to the middle. But you can choose to have it jump to a registered AF point. There's a good article on my website about registered AF points and how you use them and how you configure them. For the 5D Mark IV and the 7D Mark II, there's an additional button. There's the AF area selection lever or toggle. And again, it's configurable. So one of the things is that normally the way you change your arrangement of AF points from, say, a single point to a block of 9 or all of the points is you'd have to press that AF selection button on the top right, and then you have to nudge the little lever to make it change patterns. So here we are, and we're changing the function of the AF selection lever. Now in this case we're looking at the screens from a 5D Mark IV, but actual fact they're pretty much the same as the 7D Mark II apart from with the position of the actual selection button. And so it can be assigned several different functions, but the one that we want to use is the direct AF area selection. Again, by default it would be turned off, but by changing to that first option, it means that now with the camera at your eye, a nudge of the AF selection lever changes from a single point to a block of 9, whatever other arrangement of AF points you'd like to use. Top tip for you today: if you need to only use a handful of the patterns, or you find that you only tend to use 1 point and a block of 9 and perhaps one of the others, turn off the areas you don't use, and then it's much faster to move around the ones that you do use. Let's move on and look at back button focus. So back button focus is a technique whereby you press a button on the back of the camera to activate focus. So typically that's the AF on button, but not all the cameras have an AF on button, and so we'll look at the star button. Now the reason that people who use sports, wildlife, action, street photography typically will set up back button focus is it allows them to keep the camera in servo tracking focus, so AI servo, and simply by pressing the back button the camera focuses, and when the subject stops you can release the back button, and now you have the ability to recompose your frame. You haven't had to change out of servo to one shot, you just literally focus, take your thumb off the back and recompose. So it means that it's a very quick and efficient way of switching between static subject and tracking subjects. Now this is a 7D Mark II and it's got an AF on button and a star button. So actually, in fact, we can have either of those buttons programmed to drive focus. If your camera's only got the star button, the AE lock, and doesn't have an AF on button, then you'll simply use the star button. It is possible to configure them for separate functions, so you can keep the exposure lock on the star and do focusing with the AF on, or switch them round, or have them both do focusing. So we're back in our back button AF, and this is for the cameras that have got custom controls. So normally you'll find that the first item on the top is the half press on the shutter button. So that's what the camera is going to do when you half press to take pictures. Now, even if you just jab at the shutter, it's going through the half press position, so it will do this function. And normally that's where focus is assigned. So what we need to do to put the camera into back button focus is actually stop it focusing with the shutter button. There are two options. So when you press the set button, it will provide you with the ability to start the metering, which is what's shown in the top right hand corner, or to lock the metering, which is in the bottom right hand corner. So I often use manual, so actual fact it doesn't really make a great deal of difference for me, but if you use aperture priority or shutter priority or program even, and your subject moves between a dark and a light environment whilst you're shooting a sequence, you'll want the camera to meter every frame individually. So you choose the middle one, which is metering start. If you took pictures of subjects which are in consistent light, you only need to meter for the first frame, and then the exposure is locked for all the subsequent frames, in which case you can assign effectively the star button, the AE lock, to the half press on the shutter. If you've got a camera which doesn't have an AF on button, then you still can do back button focus. In actual fact, the only camera, EOS DSLR camera, which can't do back button focus is an old EOS 300D. So what you do is you go into the custom functions, and you're looking for a custom function which is describing how the shutter and AE lock button operates. Now you can think of it as everything before the slash in the feature is what's operated by half press on the shutter, and everything after it is related to what's based on pressing the AE lock button or the star button on the back. So by default you have focus on the half press and exposure lock on the back button, the star button. If you choose option 1, which is AE lock on the shutter button and focus on the back button, then you've enabled back button focus, and it's locking the exposure for every frame in the sequence. If you choose option 3, then it's continuously tracking the exposure, so as the exposure change, every frame can have a different exposure in a sequence. And on the back button you've got focus. So the option 1 and option 3 are exactly like we would program the custom controls to achieve back button focus. So let's just move on. I've got one more thing if you're just starting out with back button focus, and that's to reprogram the AF on button as an AF stop. So normally when we do back button focus we switch the focusing so that it's not operated by the shutter. When you first start you'll find you get a number of pictures where you just forgot to press the back button. This is a little way to help perhaps encourage your thumb and your brain to remember to do those, because you can reconfigure the back button as AF off. So that means it's going to stop focusing when you press the back button. This means that if you're photographing something and you now need the focus to stop, you're in servo mode, remember, so it would track normally, you press the back button and your focus is going to hold where it is. That lets you recompose. So it's a kind of first step into going to back button focus, some people find quite popular, quite easy to work with, because the camera still works pretty much as they'd hoped. Custom shooting modes. This is basically a way to quickly recall a complete range of stored settings so that you can change your style of shooting or the subject you're photographing or even your approach to that subject really easily. And it's available on a good number of mid-range cameras and also the Pro Series cameras too. So you'll find that as the C or C1, C2 and C3 modes around the mode dial. What they do is they give you a way to store that camera configuration and also tune or optimize it. Here's some examples that I've used it for. So I've had a camera switch between a flash setup and a no flash available light, just by turning the mode dial. Or maybe you'd want to switch between doing wildlife, where you're tracking subjects, birds flying in the sky, so you've got various things in terms of focus setup, servo focus, certain shutter speeds involved, ISO settings, etc. And then your landscape setup, where you're going to focus perhaps using aperture priority, closing the aperture down, going for a slower, allowing slower shutter speeds. So you might have different programmed scenes. The thing is that it's not just the shutter speed, aperture and focus modes that's stored, it's hundreds of settings. So pretty much it takes a snapshot of your camera. I find that the custom modes are quite helpful if you're trying or evaluating new settings with your camera, because you can make a copy of your current configuration and then manipulate it in the custom mode till you get to something that works brilliantly for you, and then you can implement that as your standard. First step is, and the one that I found some people get stuck with, is actually turn the mode dial altered the mode that you actually want to store in the C1, C2 or C3. So once you've done that, so you turn it to, say we're going to store manual, you turn it to M, make any configuration changes you'd like, and then go into the camera's menus and choose to register to one of the custom shooting modes. That takes effectively a lift of the entire camera configuration at the time and allocates it to one of those mode dial positions. Here's an example of one where I've changed from flash and ambient light. Because within the camera there's the ability to turn the flash off. I had a setup with a flash firing. It was on an external flash. It was off camera, lighting a particular part of a location, and I tended to work with manual mode, so I've got the flash switched on. But by turning my mode dial to C1, I'd got that one stored with no flash, high ISO, wide aperture, available light setup. So I could quickly, just by 2 clicks on the dial, to go between M and C1, because the camera was a 5D Mark III, so it had a bulb in the middle. And I could switch between available light and a flash setup really quickly. I didn't have to turn the flash off to do anything. Everything moved just by turning the mode dial. I think what this means is that the custom shooting modes are effectively become your personal scene modes. The scene modes are not found on so many cameras at the advanced end of the range, but ultimately this is your way to create those scene modes, but highly tuned to the kind of photography you want to do. In my case, I also often set C3 as my video mode. It kind of reminds me that to effectively makes all my configuration changes for me. So in the case of this one, I actually move using custom controls. I change it so the main dial, which is on the front of the camera, turns the aperture. The quick control dial on the back of the camera becomes an ISO dial. I don't need to access the shutter speed because it's linked to the frame rate. And I can also change the picture style, my white balance, and for video I also make the camera go to sleep a little bit later, so I turn the power off to about 4 or 8 minutes. So it radically makes a big difference to how the camera operates. And I just simply turn it to C3, move the switch over, and I can shoot video. There is one thing that was added around the time of the 5D Mark III, so that's back in 2012, and that's the ability to auto-update the stored settings. It's not set by default, so that basically when you store a setting, that's remembered. And the problem here is that, let's say you stored f2.8 in aperture priority. If you're out working with a custom mode and you change this aperture, which you quite easily do, when you put the camera down and it goes to sleep, you pick it back up and it recovers the stored f2.8, not the f8 it was set to prior to going to sleep. If you have the auto update enabled, it would actually update the setting so that it knew that the last used setting was f8, and that would be the stored setting now with your custom mode. I use this quite a lot. Most of my cameras I enable the auto update all the time, so that as I make changes on any aspect of the camera configuration, it updates my custom mode settings, and that seems to work very well for me. But if you want to do say product photography, and you know that every day you come into the studio, you set the camera to a certain shutter speed, certain aperture, certain ISO settings, custom white balance, whatever it is, this would be turned off, so you could simply go in every day, turn it to the custom mode, and it would be the same as it was yesterday. So now we're going to look at the My menus. So My menus have been in cameras for a little while. It's the green zone at the end, and most people say, well, there's nothing there. Typically about 3 entries that says add entry and some settings. So the My menu is the way where you can locate up to 6 of your most regularly accessed camera menu items. And they can be from any part of the menu. So you might have, say, formatting cards. Most people format cards when they start a job or go for a day's photography. So you might put format cards on there. I would often put the highlight alert, which comes out the blue play menus. So I can turn this, what they're called the blinkies, on and off quite easily. Your choice is quite open. You can put, like I said, 6 items. However, more recently, since the 7D Mark II, that's been increased, and you can now have up to 5 pages of 6 items, and each page can have a title to it as well, so a name. You can see on the graphic, this is my focus page, and I've got the 3 tuning parameters from the AF cases. I've got something relating to the lens drive, I've got custom controls, and I've got the ability to find out which area modes I've got active. And that's all in my focus menu. Particularly with the newer ones, but also the older ones, you can opt to have the camera display from the My Menu tab. What this means is that when you press the menu button, the camera jumps straight to the green My Menus, not where it was last being used. If you've got a camera that's got the ability to have multiple tabs, so that's 7D2, 5D4, 5DS, and a few others, you can have it display only the green zone. So that means that you've hidden away all the other menus that you rarely use, so that as a way of working, your camera operation is much, much faster. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation and this little talk through about customizing your EOS, and we've gone beyond perhaps some of the basics. And stay by, there's going to be some more of this kind of videos coming soon. My name is Brian Worley from p4pictures.com. Thanks for watching.